So as I mentioned, I'm joined today by here today with David, who works for David Keys Consulting, and he is an expert in the field of data analysis, data visualization, and storytelling. So we're really lucky to have him not only as part of our certificate, but also here to ask and answer any of those relevant questions that you guys have. So just in terms of an outline today, we will review what's been discussed in Module 3 and 4. We'll review some of the common data visualization questions that we have that come from youth program evaluation, and then we'll have some open discussion. And there will be opportunities for open discussion throughout the webinar as well. So any questions you have related to the certificate, anything related to assignments, maybe you have specific questions related to your youth program, we'd love to hear all of those. So please, as I mentioned, use that question box, and we want to make this as interactive and engaging as possible for you guys. So just to review what has been discussed in Module 3, which is all around analyzing your data using spreadsheets. We had Sydney join us on a webinar last week, which is really, really informative. And during that time, we really talked about 8 different formulas that we use to analyze our data. We talked about using min and max and trying to calculate the average. So a lot of really, really great things that hopefully you've been able to use in your assignment too, to better understand your program data. You also went over pivot tables as well. And hopefully for some of you that was the first time that you've done pivot tables and a great introduction to you. I know Sydney did a really great job of actually walking us through how to create a pivot table and what we can do in pivot tables to help with our data analysis on our webinar last week. And then we also talked in 3B about calculating descriptive statistics. So again, not only did we look at those pivot tables, but we also looked at forecasting data and calculating and interpreting our central measures and measures of distance. So hopefully you've been able to finish that content so far, which will allow us to have a really good understanding and a really good framework to build off of when we look moving forward at our Module 4. Okay, so I'm actually going to turn the floor over to David, who's going to, since he was the one that actually facilitated Module 4 for the learning platform, I'm going to allow you guys, have him share just kind of an overview of what is discussed. I know some of you guys might just be starting this because based on our recommended timeline, this is Monday was the first day to start this. So this might be a quick recap for you, but it also might be a good introduction to what's to come. So I'll pass the floor over to you, David.
Great, thanks, Corliss. Hello, everybody. Hello from Portland, Oregon, south of the border. You can see my little poster behind there. I'm delighted to talk with folks in Canada. So just to provide kind of a brief overview, the Module 4, I know, as Corliss just said, some of you will have started it, others may not have. I'll give you just kind of a brief overview in terms of what it actually involves. So in putting together the lessons for this, I really kind of focused on, or for the Module 4A especially, focused on 4 areas. Number 1 is knowing your audience. Data visualization is only as useful as you make it in terms of communicating with a specific audience that you want to communicate with. So if you're working with a highly technical audience, you would want to communicate in one way. If you're working to communicate with program staff, you're going to communicate in a very different way. If you're working to communicate to funders, you're going to communicate in a different way. But the most important first step is really to think about who your audience is. I also strongly encourage people to keep it simple, especially when you're starting out. Excel wants to push you, if you're using Excel, which many people do when they start out, wants to push you to do some less than ideal things. For example, you've probably seen some crazy 3D exploding pie graphs, that type of thing. Not generally your best choice. Stick with some really simple graphs, some simple design, and that'll actually make it a lot more effective in terms of your ability to communicate. And in the module that I give a bunch of examples in terms of what that looks like. We also in the module talk a lot about using one message per graph. So the way I typically explain it to people is that you should think about each graph as a sentence, not as a paragraph. So if you're trying to communicate more than one thing in one graph, stop and think about separating it into multiple graphs so that each graph can tell that sentence, and then you put them together, and that's how you make your paragraph. We also talked a lot about, in the module, about using some solid design principles. I'm actually going to read a quote that's in the module that I think is really effective. And the quote is from Gar Reynolds, and it says, "You can achieve simplicity in the design of effective charts, graphs, and tables by remembering three fundamental principles: restrain, reduce, and emphasize." So in the module, we talk a lot about restraint in terms of keeping things simple, reduce in terms of getting rid of any kind of quote unquote chart junk, excess items that you just don't really need, and then emphasis, using color, using ordering in your graphs to actually emphasize the main point that you want folks to take away from it. And then finally, the last thing we talked about was choosing the right chart. Now, there isn't so much a single right chart, but there is a more appropriate chart for the type of data that you're working with and the type of message that you want to communicate with. And I give you some examples of when to choose which type of chart, as well as some resources that I point you to in order to have you think about ways that you can select appropriate charts for your future work. So in module 4B, which was about data storytelling using spreadsheets, it was really kind of a practical application, or is a practical application of the types of principles that we talk about in 4A. And I walk through giving some examples of several different types of charts. We start with bar charts because I think that's, for many cases, especially where you're doing any kind of comparisons between groups, which is pretty common in the types of fields that folks on this webinar work in. Bar charts are the best way to really start out. And particularly they're preferable to pie charts. In the module, we talk about some serious issues with pie charts and why bar charts are a more effective tool typically. And I walked through a bunch of design steps that you can use in order to make your bar charts even more effective. We talk about line charts as well, particularly when you want to show any kind of change over time. Line charts are going to be your best choice to demonstrate that type of change. And the nice thing is, as well, the principles that we talked about with the bar charts in terms of color, ordering, reducing chart junk, etc., applies to line charts and indeed all charts that you might make. And then I gave a couple examples of some charts that you may not have seen before: slope graphs and dot plots, which are sort of subsets of line charts, but they're really effective at showing kind of before and after. So again, for the types of programs that folks in this webinar work in, you are often wanting to show kind of before and after. And these are two really excellent ways of demonstrating that. Module 4B finishes off then with pointing you towards a bunch of online resources, because the amazing thing is today with the internet, there's so many places that you can go in order to get resources to make your data visualization and data storytelling even more effective.
Perfect. Thank you, David. So we're going to open the floor up now, just to give people an opportunity to ask any questions that they do have, whether they've either finished Module 3 or Module 4, or just even before they get started. If anybody does have any questions, we'd love to hear. We did have one question that did come in while you're talking about, I know you mentioned about different audiences, and I'm wondering if you can speak to, say you have the same results that you want to communicate, but you want to communicate that to like an adult audience versus a youth audience. Do you have suggestions of either what graphs or tools or different ways, whether it's like infographics versus reports? Can you speak to, yeah, some recommendations of how you would do that between
Sure.
youth and adults?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one thing I might think about, it's a little hard to know without knowing a bit more about the specifics, but one thing I might think about if I were working with younger folks, and this is speaking actually as a former elementary school teacher, I would definitely think about starting with a presentation, especially if you have younger folks who maybe aren't quite as versed with data visualization and understanding how to interpret it. instead of just giving them a graph or giving them a report, for example, and saying, okay, read this and figure out what's important here, I'd actually start with a presentation, and I'd actually start with some explanation. I wouldn't even go to the results first. I would start with explaining the graph and say, I mean, you would know your audience, but it might be useful to review, okay, this is our x-axis, this is our y-axis, what are we plotting on the x, what are we plotting on the y? What are we able to demonstrate then as a result? So walking through it with younger folks who might not be as familiar, I think would be really effective. With adults, I think that's where you're more likely to be able to present things in writing and expect that they'd be able to make sense of it. But I also wouldn't overestimate that. I think people, when you're doing your own data analysis and visualization, you get really wrapped up in it and you assume that it makes sense to everybody. And so, again, presentations can also be effective in that case. And also, as you mentioned, Corliss, infographics are a really nice way of providing some kind of short bullet points so that people can get the kind of quick hits, and then if they want to read a deeper report, can dive into that as well.
Okay, great, thank you. And I've actually had somebody email me the other day during the certificate to ask a question around, oftentimes in large reports, you have that executive summary, and they were asking if I'd ever seen anybody use almost like an infographic as their executive summary instead of just having a 1 or 2 pager summarizing all the results. Have you seen that before or used that at all before?
Yeah, I haven't. I couldn't point you to a specific example off the top of my head, but I definitely have seen that type of thing. And of course, the borders in terms of like what counts as an infographic can be a little
Right.
bit fuzzy, but I think the traditional model for executive summaries is primarily text-based, but there's
Mm-hmm.
no reason that needs to be the case. And I think using visualizations in the executive summary, laying them out in a way that someone can easily scan and just see the kind of main results
Right.
visually, as opposed to having to actually read the executive summary, I think can be incredibly effective. And so
Okay.
yeah, I would definitely be a proponent of that.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Okay, I don't think anybody else has any questions right now, so we'll move on to the 5 common questions that we had prepared. 1 or 2 kind of came in from, again, throughout the certificate, and the other couple have been either questions that David has received quite a bit throughout his work working as a consultant. So we thought that we'd share some of our results and insights onto these that maybe extend some of the work that goes beyond what's actually just covered within Module 4. So the first question is around understanding what the best type of graph is. So I know you in 4B you really go into detail on bar charts versus pie charts. Before you actually answer that question, I did want to launch a poll and just to see what graphs people on this webinar are typically using. So I'm going to launch that really quickly, and then we'll hear your answer. So in the past, how have you actually visualized your data? Whether it's maybe you've never done this, maybe you tend to use bar graphs, pie graphs, tables, or maybe something else. Okay, so most people are using charts and tables, and then a few people are using bar graphs and pie graphs. So we have some variation across the board. Perfect. Just always important to know where people are starting from. So maybe David, you can share some insight in terms of what you think the best graphs
Sure.
are for different contexts.
Yeah, and I mean, this question is a bit of there's a bit of a straw man here. There is, of course, no best single type of graph, and the answer is it really depends on what you want to demonstrate. Um, the one thing I would say is that starting off by getting away from pie charts is a really good initial first step. And there are some specific reasons why. Specifically, if you have more than, say, 3 or 4 slices in a pie chart, research has shown that it's actually incredibly difficult for people to be able to accurately see which slices are larger. So it ends up, it seems like a totally intuitive type of chart, but in fact, when you do research on it, you see that people misinterpret the data. So bar charts are typically kind of preferred to pie charts in that case, because it's really easy if you have a bar chart to see exactly how long each bar is. So that I would say that's in terms of a best type of chart, no best type of chart, but speaking generally, avoiding pie charts is going to be a really good first step. And again, I think it really just depends on the type of work you want to do. But I would say don't people think, oh, I don't want to make a boring bar chart or a simple line chart. Um, and oftentimes try to go beyond that to come up with novel ways of presenting it. And it might look interesting, but in many cases it's not actually that effective in terms of communicating. So I would urge you to be restrained in terms of thinking about the type of charts that you want to use.
Okay, thanks for sharing that. One question I did have, because I know pie charts are something that you can very easily visualize if you maybe only wanted to share like one piece of the pie. So
Mhm.
say, for example, maybe you had 6 pieces of your pie, but you want to, again, highlight one specific sentence, one specific piece of your results. Would you advocate for pie charts being okay in that respect when, say, you want to illustrate that 65% of something?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm not. There are certain people who are like 100% anti-pie chart. I'm not one of those, and I think the example you just gave is a really good case where using a pie chart is totally appropriate. I like to use them actually when I have basically 3 or fewer slices.
Okay.
I think they're really effective, and especially if you just have one slice, it almost serves as like an icon
Right.
to show, exactly the percentage. So yeah, I think
Okay.
that's totally appropriate.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Um, so I will just put another plug in as we go through these 5 questions. If there are any attendees that do have questions along the way, please feel free to jump in and we can pause or add your question in at the end as well. Okay, so the next question is, where can you look to find examples of high quality data visualization?
Yeah, so I apologize because most of these are going to be US centric because I am based in the US. But I would definitely start with the New York Times, particularly their Upshot section. They do excellent data visualization, and they do both very kind of traditional, you'll see a lot of bar charts, line charts, that kind of thing, and they also do some really fun interactive stuff as well. Washington Post also does excellent work. The website 538, which does election predictions and many other things. The Economist also has an excellent graphics team. So those are a few places that I would recommend. But basically, I would start with journalism, because the job of journalists is to communicate to a wide audience. Um, I'm a PhD former academic, and I love academics, but oftentimes our skill is in communicating can often be a bit limited, and so I think learning from journalists in terms of how communicating to a wider audience, particularly for the folks again on this webinar who want to communicate with I know not always technical folks. Journalists are going to be the best model to follow in general, I think.
That's a great suggestion. Okay, thank you. I wrote down a few of those ones that you mentioned. So in our webinar wrap up email, I will also send a few links to some of those websites that you suggested so that the folks here can go ahead and take a look as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think this question has maybe been answered a little bit just based on our first question about pie charts. Do you have anything else you'd like to add about pie charts that we haven't chatted about?
Well, the one thing I would add is if you are going to use a pie chart in the case that we talked about, where you have, a small number of slices, using color effectively can actually make a big difference. So don't use a pie chart and have, 10 different colors. If you want to just highlight the 65%, say, You could have the other slices, but just have those be gray, so they're really kind of minimized in importance, and have the main slice, the 65% of students who did whatever, have that be red or orange or blue or some color, so that really pops out and it's clear that that's what the pie chart is intended to show.
Perfect. Okay, good suggestion. Okay, another question coming in is, if I'm telling stories with data, aren't I just telling people what to believe about data? Shouldn't they come up with their own ideas?
Yeah, so in the module, I talk a lot about using, for example, descriptive titles. So not just saying percentage of students who completed this training or whatever the outcome is. I would actually, in that case, say 75% of students completed the training. And some people find that a bit problematic because they feel like, well, I, as the data analyst, am guiding people, I'm telling them what to think. And I think that's actually a valid concern, and I think it can depend kind of on what your goal is. When I make data visualizations, it's really kind of in two contexts. One is presenting it to people in order to enable them to kind of play with and understand the data, and in that case, I wouldn't give a title. But if we're presenting kind of like final results of a program that we had and we want to demonstrate its impact, leaving it up to people to find the results is it's just likely not to happen, and as a result, people are not going to get anything out of your data analysis. And so I think it's much better you having done all the work to analyze your data and visualize your data, are the expert in your data, and I think it's okay to own that. You're not lying with the data, you're simply highlighting some of the important findings. There's no reason why someone else couldn't go back and look at their own to find their own other findings. But I think it's better if it's a choice between having people not really get much out of it and having people get the message that you think is most important. I would definitely go for the latter.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. And especially thinking about who your stakeholders are, who your audiences are going to be. Oftentimes, funders don't have tons and tons of time to read a 40-page report. So the fact
Right.
that you can make it highlight all of those important findings that you really want to drive home to your funders, I think it's a great suggestion to do that.
Mhm.
Okay. Last question we have here is, what type of software do I need to make cool data visualization?
Yeah, so people get very attached to software, I will say sometimes myself included. But speaking generally, the software doesn't really matter that much. It's generally about what you do with it. And for most people starting out, I would definitely recommend starting with Excel. It's something pretty much everybody has. And the great thing with Excel is there are tons and tons of online resources for making high quality data visualization. So I give these resources in the module, but I would definitely highlight the work of Stephanie Evergreen and Anne Emery, who are two writers and teachers who have done a lot, and they have on their websites, well, I guess Corliss, you'll share the links. They have really nice kind of step-by-step tutorials for how to make a bunch of different types of data visualization. So for example, the slope graphs and dot plots that we talk about in the module, there are links to their websites which have those specific tutorials that walk you through that. So again, I would start with what you have, and for most people that's Excel. When you get further along, there are other tools that you can pick up. Tableau is gaining in popularity. Data Wrapper is an online service that I like as well. But yeah, focus on what you have to start out.
Perfect. Yeah, and I think Microsoft Office, as you mentioned, Excel specifically, but looking at PowerPoint and Microsoft Word too, they're very much jumping on the data visualization train in terms of having now built into the newer versions of Word and PowerPoint those like tons of icons that you can pick from. So instead of just your basic shapes and whatnot, say you wanted to illustrate something in terms of gender, how many males, females you had in your program, grade. You can kind of use different icons to also help visualize, maybe beside a pie chart or just a stat or something like that. So it doesn't need to be expensive or costly. It can be, yeah, something you already have on your computer, or there's, as David mentioned, a lot of online free resources that you can look at too. So I'll definitely share both of those two websites. I know they're embedded a lot, or you refer to them quite a bit within Module 4, but yeah, I'll kind of share their home website too, so that'll allow people to scroll around a little bit and just see what else they have to offer in addition to what you've really highlighted from their website within the certificate.
Great.
Perfect. Okay, we're going to open up the floor to our attendees now, just to see if there are any more questions coming through. Again, if you have anything related to your own specific program eval that you're doing, anything related to an assignment, we're here for you to answer those questions now. And it's sometimes great to ask during a webinar format instead of just sending an email. So maybe we'll give about 30 seconds, 40 seconds for anybody, if anybody does have a question, to ask now. Nothing has come through just in the past minute or so, but if not, that's actually about it for us. So David will actually be the person that is going to be reviewing your assignment 3 submissions. So there's been a few that are starting to trickle in now, but over the next week and a bit, David will be taking a look at each person's assignment and providing some feedback on those. So if you plan on doing that, or you have questions leading up to submitting assignment 3, please feel free to reach out to me, or David's contact was in the slides, and I'll give you access to the slides and the webinar as well. So please feel free to reach out to him as well. It doesn't seem like there are any questions coming in. So with that, I will provide just a friendly reminder that your second assignment was due at the end of last week, although these are just suggested timelines for you. And then your data visualization report, which is your third assignment, is due at the end of this week. So this week also marks the wrap up for Module 4 and for the certificate. And then that leaves us with one additional week for makeup, with the certificate ending on the 2nd of November. So I encourage you, if you are still working through that content, just to keep those timelines in mind. And if you do have questions leading up to that, please reach out to me or David. So I'll give a final plug here, and I know a lot of people that I've talked to through the certificate already that are planning on attending our big event this week. I'm hosting a pre-conference workshop with Sydney, who facilitated last week's webinar, all around using Excel for data analysis and visualization. So this will kind of extend the work that we've done here in this webinar, and actually it's hosted in a computer lab. So we will have you guys actually creating some of these different graphs that you can use. And then we also have on the 25th a great day, tons and tons of different events and talks and keynotes coming. So we have a movie screening that's being released, all that sort of stuff. So encourage you to register. It's free. So if you haven't already done so, there is still time to do that. And that's it. So thank you again for taking the time to join us today. David, great. We appreciate you having on board as well. And yeah, again, please send questions if you have them. Otherwise, we look forward to reviewing those assignments. All right, take care. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.